something that I think we can grow into, and that hopefully we are continuously growing into, the more we experience about life. Because the word itself means to suffer with. And so when we are compassionate with someone or towards someone, it's because we somehow or other identify with what they are going through. Another word is empathy, as opposed to the word sympathy, which kind of removes us one step away from what someone else is going through. But empathy or compassion gets us right in there. And so for us to become compassionate, we have to continuously leave ourselves open to feel what other people are going through. And so our response to them connects perhaps more on even an emotional level than anything else that we might do. And that sometimes that act of compassion can be nothing else but saying, I understand what you're going through. Not that I know what you're going through, or I've gone through this myself. So I understand how it feels to lose a loved one or go through this kind of sickness or whatever it might be. One of the great sentiments, if you will, of Jesus' humanity is his compassion. And that's why it's important for us to remember that the compassion that Jesus manifests in the gospel is not just something that happened then. That the compassion of the Lord continues for you and for me in this time that we live and forever. Because the compassion of Jesus is meant to be something we can rely on, that we can come to, that we can experience, no matter what's happening in our life or where we are on life's journey. That's one of the reasons why when we read a gospel like today, we can see that even though in his humanity, Jesus shows that he understood it very well. He was compassionate towards the disciples because he knew the fatigue that came from being the servant of everybody, of coming upon a group of people as he sees them, and he sees them like sheep without a shepherd, and he moves to teach them. Also in other places, he moves to make sure that they have food, but he wants them to understand, first and foremost, that God knows their life, their suffering, their difficulties, their joys for that matter, but knows more about them and their life from the inside out. And that's why God can be relied on, can be trusted, can be called upon, because the Lord knows from his own experience of our humanity what it is that we endure, what it is that we suffer. You know, when David gets this brilliant idea about building a house for God, for the temple, for the ark, I should say, he's reminded that that's not his job description. That's going to be taken care of by somebody else in his line. He is the one who is charged to continue to be the shepherd of this people. But that God is going to be faithful to this people, because he says, I will build you, David, I will build you a house. Not a physical house. But I will guarantee that because you have been faithful, that there will always be a descendant of yours on the throne. Now, in point of fact, after they come back from the second exile in Babylon, there are no more kings. That line ends as far as that tradition goes. But the promise remained. And the people began to understand that this faithfulness of God, the God who had taken compassion on this people time and time and time again, was going to remain faithful to them. Faithful to that promise he made to David, and faithful in a way that they could only hope for. Because in the course of time, it becomes fulfilled when the Messiah comes, when Jesus comes on the scene. That's when the eternal Son of David is in their midst. And even though they don't recognize him, God's promise is fulfilled and continues to be so. And the importance of this is that this faithful Lord, this faithful God, this one who loves us more than we can even imagine or even ask for, this compassionate one, is consistently with us. He is perpetually reaching out to us, being faithful to us, because so often we are like the sheep without the shepherd. All of us. We can wander around, we can wallow in our own misery, we can wonder time and time again, does God care? Does God love me? Does God care about what goes on in my world, or about my family, or in the world around us? Does any of this matter to this God at all? And the question is, why should we doubt the faithfulness of the one who said to David, I'm going to build you a house. I'm going to make sure that you understand that there will always be somebody on the throne. There will always be this one who will be ultimately faithful. The one that reaches out with compassion. That's what leads St. Paul, or somebody in Paul's school, in the letter to the Ephesians, to say that Christ came and through his cross he tore down the wall that existed between Jews and Gentiles. When those words were written, the people understood, if they knew anything about the temple in Jerusalem, they understood that there was this wall that literally separated the court of the Gentiles from where the Jews were allowed to go. No Gentile was allowed to go where a Jew was allowed to go in the temple. Because if they transgressed and went through, they were liable to death. And so what Paul is saying is now, because of what Jesus has done, because of the compassion, the understanding of this God, of the suffering of people, that wall now is taken down. The faithful God can now reach both Jew and Gentile. That the love of God, the mercy of God, and ultimately the compassion of God is for all, not just for a few, not just for the chosen, but for everybody. And so that compassion, that suffering with and understanding our life from the inside out, is for the whole world, not just for a chosen few. This is how God's faithfulness is manifested, in that this love, this mercy, this kindness, this compassion of God reaches to everybody. And so for us, first of all, I think we are constantly called back to lives of compassion, which means that we need to be sincere in our praying, and that means that we need to be people who pray. Now, Not just on Sunday when we come to church, but every day. Not necessarily formally, but just to raise our minds and hearts to God on a daily basis and ask for that grace to have an open mind and an open heart and open eyes and open hands to the people who cross our path. Whether they're people in our family that maybe we don't pay all that much attention to because they're sort of like the furniture. They're always there. But yet, maybe we need to really clue in again to them, to try to see what's really going on in their life, or to our neighbors, or to even strangers that may come across our path who, say something to us, or we see that they're going through a hard time or whatever, and rather than just keeping our distance because we don't want to get involved, maybe to see that as an invitation to manifest this faithful compassion and mercy of God in Christ to this person in this moment. We can't do it for absolutely everybody because we aren't Jesus. Imagine how the apostles felt when Jesus said, let's get away for a while, and rest. And then all he does is throw himself right back into dealing with the crowds. And the apostles are there saying, well, so much for that, But yet they were being taught something. That the needs of God's people, the needs of the people whom God loves, have to take a priority over one's own leisure. When there's a need, as any of you who are parents understand, no matter how tired you are or were in a day, if your kid needed something, you would respond. Or when your child needs something, you respond. How much more when God's people need something, need love, need understanding, need to be cared about, does God want to reach to that person? And most of the time, that reaching is done by you and by me, by our words, by our actions, by our compassion, because we can identify with the suffering of that person. Maybe we haven't suffered exactly the same thing, but yet there it is. The need is presented, and even though I might not want to take the time, or maybe I can't take the time, I can keep them in my heart, in my prayer, and then maybe let somebody else know that this person is in need of help, or reach out to them later after I take care of my immediate responsibility. Doesn't mean that we have to do everything, but we can't excuse ourselves from doing something. Just think, but those of you who were here last Sunday, just think of the reaction when Sharon Nemedy went down on the floor. We have people spring into action, people who cared, people who understood, who showed compassion. Not that the whole congregation didn't, because we all prayed together then for her. But that's an act of compassion there. Something simple, whether it's, the attending to her medical need at the moment, or just comforting her, or assuring her that there was help that was on the way. And then facilitating all of that, with doors that were being held open by people and all kinds of things that were done. Everybody responding in a different way. That's the compassion of the faithful God in the people of God manifest in the midst of this congregation. So we ought to give thanks to God that we have grown in that way through all of our life, and that we can continue to grow in that compassionate response. God deliver us from having to do that, very often in church. Nobody wants to be the next one. But that still, that we can point to something concrete and say, yes, here it is. Here's a living proof and demonstration of it. And hopefully then that we keep that in mind and in our heart and in our prayers so that we can respond accordingly to those opportunities that the Lord gives us, that we come upon in our daily walk. This Jesus, the compassionate one, feeds us with himself so that we can become more truly like him in every way, so that we can extend that suffering with that compassion, that empathy into the world that we live in, one act at a time.